Okay, my name is I'm Carl Twigg. I was born and raised in Westminster all my life, with the exception of the war years, and I remember the things very well. I was born, of course, in 1920, and I remember when cars were coming in pretty well, and where there was all kind of automobile dealers from Ford, Chevrolet, Buick, Pontiac, the whole works, even old Essex and cars like that. Momentarily, the main things that I remember in the early days was I remember the mom and pop stores so well. And within the block, I lived in West Main Street, Westminster, for 17 years before I moved to the country, but still in the Westminster area. The mom and pop stores were really something, and there were many of them. And in this day and age, which I shouldn't get involved in that, our mothers were mostly, they stayed home. As far as my mother's concerned, she never went to the grocery store, because in those days, and when I say those days, I'm talking talk about the 30s, right before the main depression hit. When you wanted groceries, you just picked up the phone and you called the grocery store, and they would take your order, and then they would deliver your groceries on the same day, and that was quite something. Now, in a way, that gave the housewife time to do her wash and her darn her socks, and do the cooking and housekeeping in general. In other words, as I remember, in the early days, my mother very seldom ever left the house. She just had so much to do. She didn't have time to go around and sporting and things like that. And while I'm on that subject of maybe our parents leaving the house, when I was in school, our parents very seldom ever went to school. They just didn't have time to go to school. And then another thing in my time that I remember very well is there wasn't any unemployment. Everybody had a job, and if you wanted a job, there were still openings, because people would either retire or would pass on to something, and then there would be an opening. When I was a little boy, and I'll say when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I had my first job. In those days, magazines weren't sent in the mail very much. If you go to stores today, you see thousands of magazines. In my day, in the younger days, there weren't any magazines in stores. The certain publishing companies would hire boys to sell magazines house to house or something like that. And that is what I did. When I was 11 years old, I worked for the Curtis Publishing Company, and I sold Saturday Evening Post and the Ladies' Home Journal and the Country Gentleman. And the first week that I had my job, I made 9.5 cents. And that was real big. In those days, a penny was really important. And everybody saved their pennies. Maybe these days, you'd see a penny on the floor, you might not bother to pick it up. But in those days, you would pick it up. And one thing I like to say about the economy in those days, it was very interesting, and I guess we didn't miss the days that like you have today, where the economy is so crazy. But momentarily, as I said before, everybody had a job, and everybody had a job to do, and they were proud of their jobs. If you hired a plumber or a carpenter or electrician, they wanted to do you a good job, and of course it didn't cost very much. But once again, let me get back to the economy a little bit, because I remember that so well, and I like to talk the monetary fund. As I said before, a penny was a penny, and in the mom and pop stores, you could go in and get it for a penny. You could buy penny candies. You could buy a marble for a penny. You could buy cookies for a penny, and then that was it. And also, many people don't remember, in the later generations, between 1930 and World War II, there were many what we call penny machines outside of stores and like that. And the penny machine was made by a company by the name of Pulver, P-U-L-V-E, or Pulver machines. And they were red and yellow and green. And they were outside of stores, and they had Adams chewing gum in them. And for a penny, you put a penny in, a little clown would turn in the machine, and it would give you a piece of gum. Okay, now, over a period of time, those machines disappeared. And it was unfortunate because they realized how important the penny was in the early days, but maybe not as much in the later days, because the machines got busted up and the people would have maybe almost a day's wages in those machines, like 75 cents or $1. Whereas before that, everybody was very, very happy with the way the machines were used. But anyhow, so every time I see a penny, I guess I think of those machines. Another thing that I like to say about the olden days is in the small towns, of which, of course, Westminster was considered a small town, as was Hampstead and Mount Airy and New Windsor and Union Bridge and Manchester. And many of those were what we call Saturday night towns. Now, the Saturday night towns were quite something because everybody, it seemed like half the county would show up in downtowns in these little towns. And on a Saturday night about 8 or 9 o'clock, it was almost as crowded as Times Square. And many people would come down and park their cars in the afternoon, and they would sit in their cars and watch people that go by on Saturday nights. And that was almost like entertainment. And then, of course, the stores stayed open till late. Doctors' offices stayed open late. The banks stayed open till late. And it was quite different. And my wife and I often have said that we thought we lived in the best of times. Now, basically, you don't remember the bad things, I guess. You just remember the good things. The one thing I will say, in the great difference in the time that I spent in my early years and the time that I now live in, medical conditions have improved just absolutely wonderfully. Social events, I don't think, have caught up with the technological part of our society. Technology has advanced so much in our society and is advancing daily that I guess we forget. So when I think of the old times, or times when I was a young man, I realized that there were great innovations. I mean, like whoever dreamed that man would be on the moon once upon a time, and of course it happened. And then how telephones changed, the automobile industry changed, and industry in itself has changed. And who would ever thought that you see kids walking around the street talking to their parents with a cell phone? I mean, it was like the old comic days of Dick Tracy. In the days of Dick Tracy comic strip, they had phones on the wrist, and that was a preliminary review of what was to come, but nobody realized it. And of course, in the olden days, when we would hear and read stories about Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and like that, and going to space travel, well, that was just, no one could imagine such a thing as that. But now it has happened. So that's the way it is. Mm-hmm. Okay. What else you want to know?
Well, you did mention in the beginning about the automobiles.
Yes. Did
everybody have a car?
Oh, okay. Let's talk about the automobiles. The automobiles was a family car. The children didn't have cars. When I went to high school, there was about 100 and some people in the senior class. If there was one car, if a student had one car, oh, that was really something. And of course, that's quite different today. And also, the great innovations in the automobile industry was really something. I remember automobiles that had wooden spoke wheels, especially the old Buicks had wooden spoke wheels. Of course, there wasn't air conditioning, there wasn't electric windows, windshield wipers you had to work by hand, and it was quite something. And power steering, the automobiles, like the big cars like the Buicks and the Cadillac, they had a steering wheel that was like this. and because you had to have the ability to put the stress on the wheel to get your wheels turned. Then, of course, power steering came in. Well, that was quite something. Now today, you press a button, lock your car windows, unlock your car windows. It's quite something. And going back from the automobiles now to the still older days, of course, in Westminster and other towns in Carroll County, they were small, and they still had blacksmith and farmers. Most farmers had horses instead of tractors. The tractor industry didn't come in until a little later on. The tractor industry expanded just marvelously after World War II. Prior to that time, most farmers that I know had horses and mules, so because the blacksmiths were still in business. Now, blacksmiths used to make they used to make wagon wheels and everything. I saw blacksmiths make spokes for wagon wheels, shoe horses. If a guy brought a horse in and needed a horse shoed for just one hoof, the blacksmith would charge 25 cents. 25 cents.
Yeah.
And then he would drive the nails in the horse's hoof, and I thought that would hurt the horse's hoof. But the horse didn't even feel it. He didn't even know it. It was just like a shoe. Yeah. It was an attachment that had no pain. And I often wondered about that whenever I see a horseshoe nail, which you don't see them very often anymore, unless you go to horse shows. And I often wonder about how the blacksmiths, how their backs held out, because they would have to hold up, the horses stand on 3 legs, and they'd hold the horses up one leg to shoe. Right. And that, the blacksmiths, I wonder how his back just held out, but it did.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of those blacksmiths, they were pretty tough and pretty strong. And one blacksmith that I went to one time, I worked in the construction industry later on, and I'd have to take picks and axes to blacksmiths to get them sharpened and repaired. And I knew one blacksmith, and he had the most marvelous handship you ever saw, penmanship you ever saw. He would write his own bills, and you would think a blacksmith would be a little too rough to write his own bills, but he would write better than a banker.
Let's talk about the banks a little bit. What were the banks like then?
The banks were quite different than today. Now, in most cases, especially in the rural areas, the directors of the bank were mostly farmers and very well-established businessmen. I mean, they were very particular who they asked to be a bank director. Now, in the early days, I knew most of the bank directors, and when I started the banking system, I was in the 1st grade, and one of the main banks would have somebody come around and they would talk to you about savings. And in those days, savings seemed to be more important than it is today. However, if a person had a nickel or a dime to take in the school savings, that was really something. And once in a while, some child from a very affluent family would bring maybe a quarter or 50 cents to the bank, and I thought that was really something. I thought that their father was probably the richest in the world. Although in those days, if a person had maybe $100,000, they were considered very rich. Now today they talk about not only millions, but billions and trillions. But that's a great difference. Also, one thing about the banks. Now, there would be 3 or 4 banks in a town. And it was interesting that the banks, they had cages in front of them, sort of like they had vertical bars made of brass, and that sort of, I suppose they thought protected the banker. But anyhow, now when you go to a bank, it's just like almost going to a store where they just have little shelves, and that's quite different. Also, in the banks, they very seldom changed personnel. They had their own tellers, and a teller would be a teller for a long time before he ever got to any other position in the bank. And then in other words, they had a lifetime job. And then also in those days, you sort of had your favorite teller. You'd go to one teller. Every time you went to the bank, you would go to the same teller. And he knew you, or he or she knew you, and that's the way the banking business was. And of course, I said before, on a Saturday night, the banks would be open, And I guess if people had any money to deposit or they wanted to get any money out, that is when they would go to the bank. Okay?
Excuse me. I'm sorry. Let's talk a little bit about the hospitals. That poor blacksmith, where would he have gone if his back hurt?
Pardon me?
Where did the blacksmith go when his back hurt?
Well, I don't know. I guess he just went to the doctor. He just went to the doctor. But I knew the one blacksmith that I mentioned had beautiful handwriting. I'll tell you a true story about that fellow. Well, most everything I'm talking here is things that I remember. I'm not digging up information that I'm just fiction. The blacksmith that I talk about, his name was Mr. Elgin. He was a wonderful fellow, and he smoked. He smoked a cigar in between blacksmithing jobs, and his blacksmith shop was out off Liberty Street in Westminster, Maryland. And that blacksmith shop, it was just an old shed, and you see cracks in the wall. The old boards had vertical boards. You see cracks in the wall. Wind would come through there, and he'd be in there in his shirt sleeves in wintertime. Well, Mr. Elgin had a very good friend, a doctor. And the doctor, to get away from all these problems, would go and talk with Mr. Elgin, the blacksmith, and he would sit in there, and that was his relaxation. Instead of the doctor going bowling or shooting pool or playing cards, he would go talk to the blacksmith. Okay, well, the blacksmith had a little bit of a cardiovascular problem, the doctor said. So he said, Mr. Elgin, I want you to come to my office. I want to check you over. So Mr. Elgin went to the doctor's office. The doctor said, I want you to see Dr. Pincoff. Dr. Pincoff was an expert cardiologist at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. That's before Carroll County had a hospital. So he told Mr. Elgin, I want you to go see Dr. Pincoff, and Mr. Elgin went to see Pincoff. But Dr. Pincoff didn't tell Mr. Elgin anything. He said, I'll get back to you, and Dr. So-and-so will get in touch with you. Well, Dr. So-and-so called Mr. Elgin one day. He said, Mr. Elgin, and he had his cigar with him. He said, you had to give up smoking. Mr. Elgin took his cigar, and in the doctor's office had a wooden ledge in his office. Mr. Elgin put the cigar on there, and he never smoked again after that. And
Wow.
He lived to be a ripe old age.
Wow.
Okay, now back to the hospital. I remember when Carroll County Hospital was started. And, of course, it was a wonderful thing, and we didn't realize how wonderful it was because in those days, if you even had appendicitis, you had to go to Baltimore to get your appendix out at the hospital. When the Carroll County Hospital started, that hospital just drew doctors like flies, and then eventually very good doctors. And then, of course, today people know what it is. It's a wonderful hospital. But once again, and then when the hospital started, there were actually the Westminster Kiwanis Club and other service clubs were pretty instrumental in pushing for donations to help start that hospital, although, of course, money came from other sources too. But there was a lot of money given to hospitals by well-to-do people that helped that hospital grow and grow and grow. And, of course, if you go to a hospital today, they have a documented board out there of people who gave donations to the hospital. But most every family that could afford it gave something for the hospital. My family gave something to the hospital, but many people that were very wealthy helped the hospital out. I think the hospital really started, got a real edge to start from the Stansbury family over in the Hampstead area. They were pretty wealthy people. And that's all they needed was just somebody to give them a start like that. And I knew many of the doctors then. Went to the hospital. Before the hospital came in the 30s, I remember about 5 doctors in Westminster, and there were then less doctors in the other towns. But you could count all the doctors on I guess 2 hands in several towns together. Now there's hundreds and hundreds of doctors in the Westminster area, which is wonderful and we were very fortunate.
Well, did they have an ambulance service then?
Well, the ambulance service was provided by the volunteer fire departments. The first ambulance that I remember Westminster had, it was a Buick ambulance, and they had that for a long time. Oh my, that ambulance for years, and that ambulance was used mainly to take people to Baltimore, although then eventually they would be taken to Carroll County Hospital. Mm-hmm. We called it Carroll County Hospital. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, there was many old country doctors really did push for that hospital. They really did push for it. And then a lot of the service clubs, and especially the Kiwanis Club, they had people on the board of directors that did a lot of work to see if that hospital got the right equipment.
Right, right. Well, so what do you miss the most about the way things used to be?
What I think what I miss the most is the towns, and they're getting so big that you do not know many people anymore. Mm-hmm. You used to go to the schools and everybody knew everybody. The teachers knew every child. When I went to just high school, if there was a high school had a freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior in the old Westminster High School, but the principal and the vice principals, if you were out of class and you shouldn't be, they knew where you should be. That's interesting. But once again, I guess the camaraderie of the town is what I miss more than anything. And I said before, we go back to the old Ma and Paul grocery stores. When you walked in the grocery store, they knew your name. They knew your name, and you didn't have much credit in those days. You just paid cash. Didn't have charge cards and all that stuff. A lot of the Ma and Paul stores didn't even have cash registers, and then they would figure your bill up on a little piece of paper or something, or little receipt books. But that's the way it was.
Yeah.
But I guess you missed. I guess today we're just sort of like a number rather than by a name, and I think that's unfortunate in a way. It's nice to grow up in a small town and have been through that. And I always felt sorry for city guys sometimes because they didn't have that. They didn't have that in their time. However, and I always felt sorry for them. However, they got through their life fine. And there's a lot of city guys I know. They just turned out great, whether raised in a small town or a city. So it didn't have anything to do with it.
Right.
But I do miss not being known,
right.
Whether it be a bank or grocery store or a dry goods store or any place you went shopping. They knew who you were, or they knew who your mother or father was. And that I guess I miss that.
Yeah.
That more than anything.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all those memories. This
That's
is
okay.
great.